That's certainly distinct, much more than that. So for example, in 1964, I happened to visit Israel several times for an international conference and spent some time there. And it was kind of interesting that at that point, 1964, the term tzionut in Hebrew among educated people was a term of ridicule. Yeah, there's these people who talk about tzionut, but we're not interested in that stuff. You come back 2 years later, it's it's awe and love. Yes, the '67 occupation certainly made a difference. Also made a huge difference, as you mentioned, in U.S. support. Right. In '67, remember, Israel performed a huge service to the United States and to Saudi Arabia. It's kind of not talked about much, but at that time there was a major conflict in the region, was between radical Islam, centered in Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism in Egypt. That was the conflict. And the United States, like Britain before it, strongly supported radical Islam. But traditionally, they've almost always supported radical Islam. Again, and secular nationalism is the threat. And there was a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Yemen at the time, kind of a proxy war, but pretty serious. Israel smashed secular nationalism. It defended Saudi Arabia. It met the U.S.-British goal of destroying secular nationalism. Remember, Nasser was compared with Hitler. Right. This was an immense service, and it changed. You take a look, yes, you're right, that's when U.S. support for Israel just exploded. It happened again in 1970. In 1970, U.S. aid to Israel, I think, quadrupled. Why? Because Israel performed another service. During the Black September, remember, Palestine and Jordan, it looked as though the Jordanian military forces were going to crush the Palestinians. Syria made some indication of moving to support Palestinians against the Jordanian attack. The U.S. was very much opposed to that, and so was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia regards the Palestinians as a threat. The U.S. did not want anyone to interfere. This was right at the time when the U.S. was mired in Cambodia. It was impossible to talk about U.S. intervention at the time. The U.S. asked Israel to intervene. Israel mobilized its forces, which was enough to indicate to Hafez al-Assad that he had to back off, and they backed off. They didn't move on to support the Palestinians, or did get crushed. I mean, starting in 1949, Israel started expanding. At that time, they couldn't invade another country, but they expanded into the demilitarized zone. A lot of the so-called terror, remember in Hebrew, there wasn't a word for terrorist until years later. The people who were coming into the country were called mistananim, infiltrators. Later they were called machablim, but that linguistic change signified an ideological change. I remember I was in Kibbutz in 1953, going with friends up to guard service in the evening. Some of them wouldn't take rifles because they knew that the mistananim were just the people who lived there, who had been driven out, who were trying to harvest their own crops, and they didn't want to shoot them. Later they became terrorists, machablim, the same people. But Israel was creating them. Israel moved into demilitarized zones, drove out Bedouin groups. These were people who wanted revenge, and they did start carrying out terrorist acts.
So you said,
and this went on right up to '67. Moshe Dayan talked about it, like the struggles with Syria. As Dayan pointed out, he said, yeah, the conflicts with Syria begin when we encroach into the demilitarized zones, into what is regarded as neutral territory. The Syrians respond, And that gives us an excuse for a big attack on Syria. And what's more, all the UN commanders understood it.
Right.
Read their memoirs. Every one of them came in very sympathetic to Israel. Every one of them left very hostile to Israel because they could see all of this happening. It certainly was a change. After 60, I mean, there are all kind of reasons, but the Kibbutzim post-67 are quite different from what they were in the early 50s or the 40s. I mean, remember that a large part of the kibbutz movement, up until 1948, was opposed to the state. They were binationalists. That's a big difference. Well, I liked the kibbutz, and we thought of staying there, but it never would have worked.
Right.
The reason was the kibbutz where I was considered the most left-wing in Israel. It was the center for outreach to the Arab community of Hashem Zaire. It was way out at the fringe. But it was so Stalinist, you couldn't imagine. I mean, I lived with relatives who were Stalinists, and I grew up in the 30s and the 40s, but I never saw anything like that. They just worshipped Stalin. And this was particularly striking because it was in 1953. You may recall that that was the time of Stalin's last and violently anti-Semitic purge, the Chomsky trials in Czechoslovakia, which were directed against Jews. It was a real anti-Semitic outburst. One of the centerpieces in the Chomsky trial was a shaliach from the kibbutz movement, Mordechai Oren. This is like a family. They all knew him. They knew that he was innocent. He was charged with being a spy for, this CIA, this, that, and the other thing. That was a centerpiece of the trial. They knew he was innocent. They justified the trials. I mean, this is beyond anything I'd ever seen. The ideological uniformity, everyone read the same newspaper, had the same thoughts. It happened to be passionately Stalinist at the time, at a moment when, for Jews to be Stalinist in the middle of a big anti-Semitic purge, when they knew that the guy who was at the center of it was being framed. That's pretty extreme. And in that kind of environment, I know I wouldn't have survived very long.